Hello everybody, this is the first video lecture of Chapter 1 in General Psychology. I try to record about 10-minute videos so that you can watch them in little pieces, and then usually there's an activity or a quiz or a discussion or something, and then there'll be more videos. So each chapter is broken up into a number video lectures. They range from maybe 3 a chapter to as many as I think 10 or 12 for the really long chapters. So let's just jump right in. Okay, let's just jump right in. It's also a good idea to print off the chapter outlines, and I'll have, as you can see here, I have the chapter outlines on the screen. So psychology, what exactly is it, and what are the origins of psychology? So the important thing to understand, and this is a quiz question, is the goal, what the goal of it is, right? And it is a science dedicated to understanding the relationship between mental processes, things that go on in our head, or in our nervous system, and behavior. So it's right here, it's bolded. That is the question, the quiz question answer: behavior and mental processes. What is the wheelhouse, if you will, of psychology has changed over time. And it's changed in part because of, I would argue that it's changed because of the technology that's available, the questions we can answer. Science happens in a social and a political context. So the questions of interest to psychologists have changed. Certainly, there were times when, well, now probably an important question would be the establishment of gender, when does life begin, these kinds of questions. And what we'll talk about here in just a second are some of the questions of historical psychologists. But it's the question about the relationship between the mind and the body is a very old question, going back to ancient times. Aristotle is credited with having raised or having drawn awareness to the dreams and states of being, being awake or being asleep or being intoxicated, and how human and social traits vary, basically the differences in personality and the differences in emotional reaction. So the attempt to answer the questions of contemporary psychology, those are not new, those are very old. And again, as science, the processes, and the technology has evolved, the way that those questions get answers has often evolved. Another historical figure prior to even the 18th century, 17th century, was a guy named Rene Descartes. Descartes, I believe, is the proper pronunciation. Occasionally, you will see the death date. This is not intended for something for you to memorize. It's really just to help you establish when in history this person was active. And this question here, this concept here of interactive dualism, is the nature of one of our first activities. Okay, so let me talk about what I mean by interactive dualism. Interactive, meaning, things work together, and dualism as in two. And the two things that this concept is about is the mind, the whatever we mean by mind, and that's for another question too, and the body. What is the relationship? How does the mind and the body, how do they interact, right? So this is the quintessential nature, nurture, heredity, environment debate. And the fancy word for that is the debate over interactive dualism. So at the conclusion of this lecture, you are invited to fill out a survey to answer. Yeah, it's a survey. And I forget how many questions on there. There's several, I think maybe 15, 20 questions. And then about questions like, I forget some of them, but questions that invite you to think about this concept, invite you to think about what exactly is the mind and the brain and how do they work together. And then after you answer a series of questions, you will score them, and it'll all describe it there, how to score them. And you're left with a score that you can interpret as, does this does the score suggest that you are what we call a monist? And a monist is someone who believes that their mind and the body are the same, that there is no separation between the two, right? Or are you a dualist? Do you believe in a difference between the mind and the body, right? And so some things to consider is, what is the difference, say, between the mind and the brain? Or what about the soul? Is the soul a function of the mind, right? Is the mind different than the brain? Where does the soul come from? Where does the soul go? Or maybe we're just what's referred to, there's this phenomenon called the ghost in the machine. And the ghost in the machine is the notion that the body is just a shell, and it is just a mechanism that houses this spirit, right? This ghost that inhabits our body. Or are the things that happen in our head just these random sort of electrochemical firings, right? And so after you've completed that scale, then you're invited to upload it. Hopefully you've seen how to do that in a previous video, and discuss or think about before you do that scale. I hope you will ask yourself the question, what do I think? Am I in there is one might assume that if you were more religious, that people who are more religious would be more likely to be a dualist, because the assumption sort of built in, at least into mainstream religious spirituality, is that there's some sort of soul that is distinctive in maybe humans, that can be separated from the body, from the machine. This always reminds me of an episode of Breaking Bad. I don't know if you've watched that, but it's in season 1, and there's an episode where Walter White and his business and his colleague, they have broken down all of the chemical makeup of the human body, and they're able to account for all the chemicals, the whole weight of the human body, into like, I don't know, 99.5%. And so the question is the remaining 0.5% that they cannot account for, maybe that's the soul. Maybe the soul weighs like, I don't know, 0.5 gram or something. So anyway, that's your first activity. Interactive dualism. Are you a monist or a dualist? Moving along, talk about a couple people here. So I have here psychology before 1800s, and the reason it's in quotation is because this notion, this term didn't exist, right? The term psychology wasn't around prior to the 19th century, prior to the 1800s, right? So, but what we do recognize throughout history, and this is an illustration of how the evolution of the science of mental processes moved very slowly in the early centuries, and then in the last 100 years, it's moved quite quickly, partly again because of technology. But in the 1600s, there is evidence that people were interested and recognized that there was some relationship between the brain and behavior. The following century, we see evidence that people recognize that when there was damage to certain parts of the brain, that seemed to affect certain kinds of behavior, and damage to other parts of the brain seemed to affect other parts of behavior. There's a story, I don't remember if it's in this chapter or if it's in the next, a video I invite you to watch, about a gentleman named Phineas Gage. And Phineas Gage was, true story, he was in 1800 and something, and he was a railroad worker, and he's out working on the railroad, and there's an explosion, and it sends this iron rod straight up through his head. It goes in through his cheek and out through his head, and he would have been one of the first case studies for psychologists to study Phineas Gage, because there's, prior to these electrodes that we have now, there's really no way to recognize or to study the relationship between the brain when the brain's attacked. So Phineas Gage would have come about in this 19th century. Then you move to the 1800s, the 19th century, and at this point, researchers are beginning to recognize again that they're more specifically understanding the relationship between certain parts of the brain affect certain behaviors and other parts of the brain affect other parts of behaviors. Then after that, we move into this era, I believe they call it the Enlightenment, right? And this is the era of the scientific method, and researchers come to understand, how to systematically ask and answer questions, and that is when psychology is born. In the next video lecture, I will start to talk about some of the people specifically to the 19th and the 20th century. I'm going to stop here.